Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's demonstration entitled 10 Reasons Why Your Brand Should Have a Podcast, plus how you can start. So before we start, we want to introduce ourselves. We are Jar Audio. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's 45-minute presentation is going to deliver to you what is a branded podcast, 10 reasons why your brand should be podcasting, how your brand can podcast, what type of brand is right for podcasting, how to choose a production partner so that you can start. And then we're going to round off with a very special offer, which I think you're going to enjoy. Who's this presentation going to benefit? It's going to benefit professionals leading brands looking to increase their engagement metrics with the ultimate goal of driving revenue by offering their audience loads of value. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Roger Nairn. I am the CEO of Jar Audio. I've got 18 years in the advertising world, working with some big brands like Netflix and Lamborghini, as well as Four Seasons Hotel. I've also worked with Walmart and other brands that are, really great storytellers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Stewart. I'm head of outreach for Jar Audio. I've been in sales and biz dev for 25 years, mostly in emerging markets. I started in independent film and new media back in the 90s and knots, moved into the environment, climate change, and have also worked in the last third of my career in software biz dev.
So why do you need to listen to us today? Our team at Jar Audio has done this very thing, creating storytelling with brands, with some really exciting brands, including Lululemon, Expedia, Cineplex, and Van City. We currently have podcasts that are either in production or live with each of them, as well as a whole bunch of other ones, which you'll be able to check out at jaraudio.com. But really, we're all about making meaningful connections between people and brands. So before we get started, we wanted to start off with some definitions. First off, what is a podcast? So there's some key elements when it comes to a podcast. It always involves an episodic series. It always involves the spoken word. It of course involves audio, and it's done in a digital manner. It also involves niche topics, which is what makes podcasting so exciting. Could be anything in and around entertainment, whether it's comedy, drama, or there's many others. Could be something news related, education. There's a whole bunch of different niche topics that you can get into when it comes to podcasting. But the format is shifting. So, you might be familiar with podcasting as just a purely mobile medium, but it's now moved to the desktop as well as the smart speaker. You might have a smart speaker in your home. It started out as audio only, but now we're seeing more audio and video together. You might be familiar with Joe Rogan. He definitely made that platform popular. Typically also you might be used to podcasts being downloaded to your mobile device, but now you can stream through services like Spotify. And podcasting was typically always a free medium, but now we're noticing more and more different entities creating a gated system where you need to pay for some sort of a subscription. So what specifically is a branded podcast? So a branded podcast is the exact same format that we just described to you, but it's owned and produced by the brand. So it is a podcast that is owned and produced by the brand, but it rarely ever mentions the brand. It's just creating great content that happens to be tangential to the brand attributes and pillars. The really most important thing, though, is that it is high value, and of course, it needs to be entertaining. So what is a podcast not? Or sorry, what is a branded podcast not? It is not advertising on a podcast. It is not rotating podcast sponsorship where, one episode is sponsored by Blue Apron and the next episode is sponsored by Casper. It is all about the show itself being owned and operated by the brand. So in a lot of ways, you need to think of it like the brand is now a broadcaster. The brand owns the show. The brand becomes that broadcaster and creates the content. It's really actually all about branded entertainment. So there's been a number of different brands that have gotten into the podcast game. This is just a very small example. Brands all the way from Tesla, but then all the way to sort of more traditional brands like General Electric. In fact, General Electric was one of the brands that started the whole idea of branded entertainment in the first place. I mean, you probably don't remember, but General Electric started the General Electric Theater back in the day, where they would produce TV content that just happened to be sponsored by General Electric. You might also be familiar with Procter and Gamble, being the creators of the soap opera that started out as branded entertainment. And of course, the Michelin Guide, owned by the Michelin Tire Company, is the very earliest form of branded content and is known as the Michelin Guide today. So we wanted to share a few examples of branded podcasts with you. Here's an example by General Electric. It's called The Message. Now, what the show is, what the show isn't, is it has nothing to do with medical devices or aircraft parts, some of the things that General Electric sell. But what it is a fictional sci-fi series about messages received from space, and it's highly entertaining. What they've done, though, is they've created this great brand halo because GE is synonymous with invention and innovation. I highly suggest checking it out. It's got Rami Malek in it, who was Mr. Robot and also played Freddie Mercury. It's a fantastic branded podcast. Another example is a show that JAR produced called Out Travel the System. It's owned by Expedia. So what is it not? It's not all about promoting Expedia deals. Because who wants to listen to that? Who wants to listen to a 30-minute episode all about just that, the brand blabbering on? What it is, though, is it's a show that gives travelers a sneak peek behind the curtain, arming them with insider tips, tricks, and hacks for how to get the best out of their travel. And where does that brand halo effect come in? Expedia is a service built on its data and travel expertise. So they're leaning into the value that they can provide to their listeners. So again, branded podcasts never or rarely ever mention the brand, rarely run advertising during the episode. In fact, we suggest that they don't at all. And there is a lot of pressure, though, that they have to deliver on value. So they really need to lean in and provide as much value to the listener as possible. So what's our promise in today's presentation? If done well, your podcast, should you ever decide to do one, will make meaningful connections between yourself and listeners of your brand. I'm gonna try that again. So what is our promise to you? It is that if you do a podcast one day and it's done well, produced well, your podcast will make meaningful connections between listeners and your brand. So we're gonna walk through why your brand should have a podcast. And there's 10 reasons.
So let's talk about reason number one. Podcasts and listenership are exploding. If we take a look at statistics, and there's lots of statistics out there, in the source you'll see Edison Research Infinite Dial Report USA 2020. There's also one for Canada 2020. They've been doing this for some time. You'll notice that monthly podcast listeners have been exploding for the last number of years and is now estimated in the US at over 104 million people. The growth skews younger. You can see the age demographic here. There are older individuals that are listening, and you can see the breakdown, but it is largely a young person's game. Canadians actually have some of the largest listening in the world, equal to the US. On a monthly basis, we're seeing just shy of 40%. Podcasting has been embraced by many, many media groups. The most prevalent is probably the New York Times, but Vox is fabulous, Bloomberg, HuffPost, CBC, of course, Bell and onwards. And in conversation with Adam over at New York Times, he mentioned in the next 3 years, all major brands will have a podcast, or at least that's his prognostication. Reason number two, podcasts allow you to reach new audiences. So podcast listeners are quite interesting. They skew as being higher educated. They're more affluent. They're loyal to brands. They have a tendency to spend more money on themselves. They like to pamper themselves with massages, bottled water, etc. They also love to learn. They're heavy social media users, and they're definitely influenced by word of mouth. Reason number 3, podcasts have high engagement levels. Westwood One did a study where they looked at the engagement value, the value that people get out of different media that they're engaging with. And the highest was news, checking the weather, of course, but listening to podcasts was number 3 with a value of 76%, even above music, above watching videos, shows, posting on social media or checking social media. So overall, podcasting engagement is double of social media. We witnessed this ourselves, but it's an industry-wide phenomenon, which is that in podcasting, specific to JAR, we're seeing listen through rates of 90 to 95% for each episode on a weekly or biweekly basis. Whereas if you compare that with YouTube, usually YouTube sees maximum about 50% watch through rates only on 1 minute.
And just to jump in here, we can't understate this enough, to be honest. This is a marketing medium that we're talking about, branded podcasts. And so the expectation is that you or your client, if you happen to be from an agency, are getting the best ROI from the medium. So it's in your best interest to create the best content possible, so that it's as listenable for as long as possible, so that you can have as much connection to that audience. And we're really proud of the level of engagement that we see, but you can get that same engagement yourself, just making sure that you're producing a well-crafted show.
Mm-hmm. And we believe there's no other marketing channel that has this high of an engagement rate. Number 4, podcasts can give you great ROI. So naturally, most marketing professionals scratch their head when it comes to measuring their content marketing ROI, but you can measure financial ROI simply enough, just like any other marketing medium. ROI is net profit divided by cost of investment times 100. But how you measure your ROI completely depends on how you measure your content success. So for example, in the next slide, perhaps you are measuring your ROI around brand metrics like awareness, authority, consideration, purchase intent. You might track your web metrics around lead generation, site traffic, conversions, SEO. And then podcast metrics might be listens or downloads, engagement around listen length or reviews. So not all ROI is created equal. So it very much depends on your specific KPIs and goals, and we can help you with ROI measurements.
So just to jump in here as well, Paul, one of the more popular things to measure these days is attribution. And, we're excited to say that attribution is now possible in the podcast world. We can tie, we can tie the attribution directly to a site visit and then on to, a purchase, for example. We're able to tie it right back to the home's IP address, which is very, very exciting and something that hasn't always been the case up until recently.
Number 5, podcasts are an intimate medium. This is where a lot of the power of podcasting comes from, because as a medium, podcasts have thrived because they're able to deliver the one thing that the internet and other mediums have not been good at, which is intimacy. It's literally in your ear. It's like a whisper. It's the voice in your head, right? It's catered to personal preference. It's mostly solo on the listener's time. Number 6, podcasts are portable. Podcasts are mostly listened to in the car or on the bus or subway during commutes, at the beach, walking the dog, at the gym. There's usually a multitasking element to it: washing the dishes, mowing the lawn, grocery shopping, working. I'm
Paul, I
guilty
think
of it.
you're a listener who likes to listen to a podcast while you're washing the dishes.
My kids know that that's daddy's time when
Yeah.
he's doing dishes and listening to podcasts. But that's the advantage of the medium, is that you're able to multitask, do other things while you're listening. BBC has done some interesting research. There's a link there as well that suggests that 94% of listeners consume podcasts while performing other tasks. And they've proved that this mode of listening actually elevates the engagement with the brand. So, for example, the study showed that the two processes that occur in order to deliver this are, number one, keeping the brain occupied enhances the ability for the brand messages to achieve cut through. And secondly, activity means that the podcast content is being taken in through low involvement processing, a much more fuel efficient process that has a lower cognitive load. As such, engagement with the content can last much longer, which is
Just to
good
jump
news
in
for
there, I
this,
mean,
for this format.
I think one of the, that's such a really cool thing because, marketers talk a lot about how busy an individual's day is and how many different brands they are coming into contact with. Let's be honest, there's just a lot out there and there's a lot of distraction. I think what this slide tells you is that if we can create fantastic content coming from the brand, and if an individual is enjoying themselves and fully engaged with that podcast, the brand message is going to get through. Something that you just don't see with most other marketing mediums.
Mm-hmm. Number 7, podcasts are a pull medium. And what this means is listeners pull them, they subscribe to the content, they actively seek out the content, they have an interest in the material that's available to them, and they subscribe to it. So they look forward to it coming.
Yeah, and again, the better the content, the more they look forward to it. Again, there's very few other mediums that are like that right now.
And listeners invest their time, right? Not just me. Podcast listeners spend an average of 6 hours and 37 minutes listening to podcasts every week. This is another stat that's in the Edison Research 2020 report. Number 8, podcasts are great for internal communications also. We often think that they're mostly for the external public, but companies and organizations can definitely take advantage of the advantages of podcasting for an internal podcast, right? So this would be a podcast that's produced by an organization, it's privately distributed, either it's a direct link or it's on the intranet, and there are measurement options which you can track to see how much engagement is your employee base interacting with the content.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. We get a lot of emails. There's a lot of different pieces of communication that are sent out from the average organization. I mean, especially these days during the pandemic. Why not deliver that content in a more emotional way, something that's going to increase the level of engagement, allow the employee to listen on their own time, where they are, however they're getting, either to or from work. We have a client that does an internal podcast, and they've heard their different employees reporting that they listen while they're brushing their teeth in the morning. There's a whole range of different ways that you can deliver it, and frankly, we're a little bit kind of bored and kind of sick and tired of just the average CEO sending out a very flat email. Imagine being able to send, just a really well-crafted conversation or story or speech even through a podcast and delivered out all across the world. Fantastic way to use the medium.
Mm-hmm. So an internal podcast, it's as Roger mentioned, it's a great break from the screen fatigue, particularly during the pandemic. Emails and intranets go unread, plus they're very one-dimensional. They're delivered in a format that staff can embrace on their own time. Again, they can multitask and do it while they're running, etc. It's great for culture building, onboarding, and development. And it's delivered in a conversational style. Again, versus an email, for example, just the use of intonation and emotion and humor, it's just a more powerful delivery of message. Reason number 9, podcasts are a flexible medium. So they're not constrained by time. I mean, Joe Rogan's podcasts, I think, are 2 or 3 hours long, right? We like to see, 20, 25 minutes, but it can be shorter and it can be longer. There's various formats. We'll talk about that today. There's ad standards. There's various topics. They can have a short or a super long shelf life. There are no rules. Number 10, podcasts have continued throughout the pandemic. So during the pandemic, audiences still want to be entertained. They still want to learn a new skill or escape, particularly now. Podcast consumption, it did dip, I think, roughly 5% in March. However, it has returned subsequently within 2 months. And we're seeing now traffic that's 10% above January. So we're back to the pre-COVID growth. And during COVID, JAR and others have been recording remotely without sacrificing any quality, particularly using the JAR Audio proprietary system for recording direct to our servers, which enhances the quality, as we've always done.
So you might be asking yourself how you can podcast as a brand. When it comes to producing a podcast, it's really about leaning into delivering value, and you can't deliver value unless you really understand what your audience is looking for, what that listener is looking for. So you really need to understand everything about that listener. So what do they need? What do they really care about? And then also, what are they listening to? What are some of the other types of shows that they're spending their time listening to? One of the best audiences is already there, and that is other podcast listeners. Again, you just need to deliver that value. So really ask yourself from a brand's perspective, how can you teach? Especially right now during the pandemic. Unfortunately, a lot of people have lost their jobs. They're going to be looking for work. What can you offer to help new skill development, or teaching them about different ways of working, or different ways of communicating through work. Like the sky's the limit, really. How can you help as a brand? How can you help? And then finally, how can you entertain? What are some ways that you can bring some levity to someone's day, or perhaps, hit somebody from an emotional angle, make them think, create conversation, maybe a little bit of controversy. What are some of the ways that you can, strike some emotion in someone? But, it does take the right type of brand, and specifically, a brand needs to have a point of view. A brand needs to have creative bravery. A podcast is available for all brands to do, but unless you're willing to really tap into some areas that perhaps you've never gone before as a brand, it might not be right for you. But again, I keep harping this. You need to also deliver as much value as possible, and you need to be constantly reminding yourself that that is the purpose of this show. Otherwise, it's just going to come across as an advertisement, and nobody's going to listen to it. Really, though, it's all about producing a high quality show. High production value is going to get listened to. Choosing the right host, being very selective with the right host, choosing the right music, whether that's custom or something stock, both are easily available these days. Applying multiple scenes to a show, and what we mean by that is making sure that the show isn't just one-dimensional. So adding some sort of what we would call texture to the show, and actually that serves a really strong purpose when it comes to producing branded content, because when you change up the scenes in a show, it actually keeps the mind of the listener engaged. And again, we're talking about trying to get as long of an engagement and listen through time as possible. So if you can find ways of breaking up the show, that will by nature keep the listener listening for as long as possible. And then also, tell great, well-crafted stories. That is what people look for from a podcasting perspective, and that's what keeps listeners coming back, time and time again. So, you can absolutely create a podcast yourself, but we always recommend that you choose a production partner. You're going to get a higher bar of quality, both from a strategic standpoint, creative standpoint, production standpoint. They're going to understand how to look at the data, pull in those analytics, but also promote the show properly. The actual experience of creating the podcast, which you would still very much be involved with, is going to be a lot more pleasant and will put a lot less strain on your organization yourself.
So when choosing a production partner, we've put together, this is the Jar Audio 4P framework. You can also consider it to be an agency checklist for you. But every podcast should have this framework where it starts with produce, push, pull, and promote. And we're going to use some examples using Jar Audio's 4P framework. Number one is produce. So here, the first concept is it's all about audience. It's less about customers. So we like all clients to consider audience first. Any agency that you work with, any production partner, should start with some kickoff workshops with the goal of covering strategy. What is your guest strategy, your season arc, your story format? From a format perspective, you have to decide, is it going to be interview based, basically in-depth interviews with sculpted question lines that really get under the hood of your story? Or is it more like a narrated documentary style script and clip, right? Podcast that you might hear on NPR or CBC on Sunday morning. Or if you want to be incredibly innovative, there is a market for fiction or science fiction, dramatic programming. The sky's really the limit. So as part of early strategy, you should be considering, well, which format is right for your goals. Any agency that has experience doing this should be able to help you with research, with writing, scouting or hiring the host, recording naturally, stock custom music, sound editing, and then hosting and distribution of the podcast itself.
Just to jump in here, if it makes sense and your host ends up being somebody from your organization, the agency you're working with should be able to train them as well, not only to feel comfortable being on a microphone, but also interview styles. Media style interviews, broadcast style interviews are really challenging sometimes. So it's always best to get some training on that front. So that they feel comfortable when they're in the middle of an interview and can focus on creating a great piece of content for the listener.
That being said, there are a lot of professionals out there, professional hosts that are not expensive, that are well-trained, that have great experience, that will do a great job as well. Mm-hmm. So depending on the format, typically a 6-episode season should take 1 to 2 months to produce the first 2 episodes, just because it is a bit front-loaded with with kickoff workshops to define strategy, etc. And then after those first 2 episodes are released, you can start a release cadence of an episode every 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the cadence that you prefer for your series. And in the calculations we've done from a capacity perspective, we've calculated that a client needs to make themselves available for about 6 days of work over this 4 to 5 month period. So some front end work, and then there's some ongoing work on a weekly basis, 1 to 2 hours. And then there's some approvals as the episodes are delivered. Number 2, push. So we handle the setup, management, and maintenance of the online podcast server to push the shows out and its episodes out to the podcast world. We use Omni Studio. It's also owned by Triton Digital, which is a large media organization. So the one thing to keep in mind here is that from a distribution perspective, it's actually quite easy. And when I say easy, I mean, once you have all of the assets and you load the episode onto a service like Omni Studio, it just simply pushes the podcast out to Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. So it's not a complicated step. And it's a step that should be handled by JAR or any agency that has experience with this.
If you have any experience posting a blog post through WordPress or Squarespace, it works very similar, to those, and very, very intuitive and easy to use.
The podcast server also will give you access to analytics, particularly engagement analytics. You know, how long did people listen, that sort of thing. Reviews, listener reviews. They provide an embedded player if you want to post these episodes on landing pages or an intranet, and also social links.
So the third pillar is pull. So Paul just mentioned the analytics that you're going to be able to pull from your online server. It's going to provide you with the real-time data. It's going to allow you to interpret the results and make recommendations on how to improve performance. And the best part is that it's all done real time. From an analytics standpoint, Paul mentioned you're going to be able to see your downloads, your subscribers, the reach of the show. What the reviews are saying. You're also going to be able to look at the demographics and the geography, all the way down to the city level. We also look at consumption. So consumption is looking at the actual episodes themselves, looking at verified plays, the average time spent listening, which is what's going to give you that great engagement level, retention, where people start off an episode, but also more importantly, where they drop off an episode. So that's going to tell you where perhaps the conversation might get a little bit perhaps stale, or maybe there's a feature of the episode that people aren't finding as useful or interesting. It's all data that you can feed into the creative team to make sure that future episodes are more, in line with the type of show that you want to produce, which is one that has a really long, amount of engagement. And then finally skips. So where are people skipping through in the episode itself? And then finally, the fourth pillar is promote. So any agency you work with should be able to offer some sort of a promotional service. So no, it's no longer the case of if you build it, they will come. You absolutely must promote your podcast. It's not a podcast without an audience. So agencies should be able to develop a strategy for you based on 6 main things. So first of all, marketing. That's where they're going to market and creating partnerships and opportunities with different media companies and social platforms. The next is PR and earned media. So creating publicity kits and trying to get those kits in front of the right media to get conversation around the show itself. The third is spotlight. So there's a big misconception that in the podcast world, if you're ever featured on the top of like an Apple Podcasts, it's because you've somehow beat some sort of an algorithm. The reality is that the big companies like Apple or Spotify have editors who are making those decisions on a human level. It's not computers making those decisions. So any agency you're working with should be able to pitch the likes of an Apple Podcast on different shows that you're launching, or perhaps there's a different theme that you think that the show might be perfect for. If it's all about Christmas and you've got an episode that's all Christmas focused, pitch them on that. Or maybe there's a certain talent on your show that you think should be lumped in with other shows. They're always open to being pitched. So you should ask your agency whether they are capable of doing that. The other area is cross-promotion. So like I mentioned earlier, podcast listeners are your low-hanging fruit. So you want to go after other podcast listeners. And one of the best ways to do that is to look for shows that are similar to yours, or at least are perhaps in the same kind of category. And then approaching those shows. They're very, very simple to get a hold of. Most of them have websites and email addresses. So you can reach out to those shows and offer to promote their show on your show and your show on their show. Or perhaps maybe you're going to swap hosts. The host from your show can be a guest on their show, vice versa. Again, there are no rules when it comes to the podcasting world. So, doesn't hurt to reach out and strategically, try to make some of those trades. And then finally, paid opportunities, whether it's done through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Google, it's always worth putting some paid media behind the show itself. But an agency should be able to tell you what the right channels are, depending on where your audience is. And then finally, we like to call this the more category. It's really all about just getting creative and figuring out what is the one thing that you can do to lean into audience growth, whether that's, encouraging all your employees to become subscribers, or, leveraging your email list, or, maybe you're a nonprofit and you've got a really strong volunteer group, approaching them through an email and inviting all them to subscribe. Just really getting creative about how best to get the podcast into as many ears as possible. So, it's one thing to promote the show, but you've also got to create, the ecosystem that goes around the show itself. So any agency that you're speaking with should be able to design, produce, or consult on the development of your podcast ecosystem. So you need to be considering the artwork for the show itself, and you want to be specific on the type of artwork. It has to be eye-catching. It has to be, it has to work under small sizes, but also work in the different players properly. You need to consider a landing page or microsite, not only for people to find the show, perhaps on your website, but for those that are listening, you might want to direct them to the website to receive more information. Maybe you want to post a blog post about the episode and provide the listener with some added information, links, videos, photography, to let them learn a little bit more on a certain topic. Social content, in order to share the show and promote the show, you want to think about social content. Think about the episode and what would go around it, almost like if you were to be launching a movie or a TV show. What are the pieces of content that are going to get people excited? What are the pieces of content that are going to drive traffic to and you can encourage people to come in and subscribe? What are the pieces of content that are going to add different layers to the show, whether it's sharing the bio of a guest or it's sharing some behind the scenes video or photography of you recording the show. Again, it's really just limited by your creativity. And then finally, social links. You're going to want to create social links, which can either be done through the host software like an Omni Studio, or you can use other programs like Chartable. Chartable creates a great product which is called SmartLink. SmartLink can be used to track full analytics of the shareable link itself. But most importantly, when you use a SmartLink and you share it through your social, it will automatically open up the most used podcast player on that user's device. So if I click on a SmartLink and I use Apple Podcasts the most, it will automatically open the podcast up into Apple Podcasts. The great thing about that is you're creating a really good user experience, which is something that podcast users also appreciate. They want to be able to just immediately listen to that episode if that's something that is of interest to them. So these are just some examples of what I'm talking about by an ecosystem, but you want to create a common look and feel just like any of your other branded content. And then any agency that you're speaking to should be able to offer some additional services. One of those services is actual podcast advertising. So up until now, we've talked about branded podcast, which is your own show produced by the brand and distributed to an audience. But you can still advertise on podcasts themselves. Now, any agency should be able to offer you, sort of two different versions. One is what we would call a baked-in advertisement, and that is where the ad lives into the actual podcast file itself, and is always there for the life of the show. Perfect example is if the host were to read an advertisement, during the show, that's then part of the actual show itself. The other angle is what we would call a dynamic ad insertion, much like the programmatic world works. These ads are served from an ad server and then inserted into the content on demand. So essentially, you're buying space on certain shows based on a certain demographic, geography, all those sorts of things. And then those shows have donuts in them that your ad is then being inserted to dynamically. So when somebody that you're looking to target is listening to that episode, they're going to hear your advertisement. So as we're getting closer to finishing up here, one of the things we wanted to deliver to you is a list of some questions that you should be able to ask any podcast agency that you're speaking to help you make a decision. So the first question you should ask is, do we get a dedicated project manager? The process to produce a branded podcast is quite simple, but it's not easy. And so it's always great to have a dedicated project manager to walk you through every step of the way and ensure that timelines are being met. You're fully aware of what the expectations are, but also they're able to manage the approval process and all that. The second question you should ask is the estimating clear? Just like anything else that you're purchasing, you should be able to get a clear understanding of what exactly all the deliverables are. Third question is, can invoicing be flexible? At Jar Audio, we're incredibly flexible with our invoicing, especially now given the situation with a lot of businesses. Any agency that you're working with should also be flexible, but at the same time being totally open and transparent on what the expectations are. The fourth question is, do you collaborate? Any agency that you're working with to produce, this level of creative product, you should be able to work directly with and be able to collaborate with them. Here at Jar Audio, we like to say that we don't like to squirrel away with our briefs and produce a bunch of ideas and then have these sort of ta-da meetings where we present you with the idea and then you're kind of just like sort of left to go with it and have no choice. We like to do a lot of back and forth. We like to ask a lot of questions. We like you to ask a lot of questions. It's really important to us. The fifth question is, are there status reports? You should be kept abreast of where everything is at from a project perspective, quite simply. And then finally, do you use project management software? We couldn't operate if we didn't have Basecamp. It keeps our lives organized. It should also keep any agency's life organized, and you should be able to access Basecamp as well, so that you're capable of retrieving files, whether you're working to reuse some of the content to promote the show, but also to have a full access to schedules and timelines and checklists and things like that. So we wanted to just take a few minutes and introduce ourselves, Paul and myself and the team at Jar Audio. So Jar Audio is a creative studio using podcasts and other long-form audio to make meaningful connections between people and brands. Our leadership team has impressive experience building brands, producing engaging digital content, and telling compelling stories. But we have a huge team behind us of writers, recordists, sound editors, and audience growth strategists that know how to hold your attention, shake you to your core, and make you feel the feels. What is our secret? Journalistic integrity blended with audio expertise. We're a full service agency, so we're able to offer everything from strategy, concept, research, host sourcing and training, writing of episodes, recording of episodes, obviously, doing the audio edit. We have custom musicians. We have musicians that are capable of producing custom audio for the episodes. We are able to do the hosting and distribution, audience growth, provide all the analytics, audio blogging, podcast advertising, and other forms of long-form audio. Anything we do, though, is creative, collaborative, and fun. It's really important to us. And we've been really lucky in our short infancy of a company to work with some amazing brands, including Expedia, Cineplex, Lululemon, Autism BC, Sage Natural Wellness, Vancity Credit Union, and the Port of Vancouver. Plus, there's a whole bunch that are not on this list because we're in the middle of producing work for them as we speak.
So what can you do to move forward? Well, Jar Audio is a full service agency, but our services also can be scalable. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example, there are certain skills that your team has in-house. For example, writing, or maybe your comms team is super strong in promotions. There's an opportunity in our collaboration to figure out, well, who is the right party to do which service, right? So if you don't need the full service, then obviously there's flexibility around who does what. Typically, a season is 6 episodes. It can be longer, it can be shorter. And also on average, like in most of our productions are custom, but on average, we're seeing episode length of about 20 minutes. Again, it can be longer, it can be shorter. And so from a pricing perspective, we price on $400 per delivered minute. And so to do the math, on average, that's about 6 episodes times 20 minutes times $400 is 48,000. Promotion is separate, but it is also scalable. So most of the promotion work that we do in terms of launching new podcasts is roughly 5 months, but it can be shorter and it can be longer depending on what the needs are in terms of the launch. Generally speaking, as we mentioned prior, it takes about 4 months to complete production and release a season. You can release the first 2 episodes within a couple of months, and then start to release the subsequent episodes on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And in terms of best next steps, we encourage you to reach out for a 30-minute consultation. There should be a hyperlink at the end of this video where you can reach out to jaraudio.com/book-a-chat to be able to schedule a call with myself, or feel free to call me or text me or email me anytime, where we can talk in more detail about branded podcasting, some of your needs, and there is an opportunity to do some brainstorming together if you're at all interested.
And as you can hear, my house is starting to come to life, which means that we are almost at the end of the presentation. But before we go, we wanted to give you a free offer for spending time with us today. So if you actually go to jaraudio.com/vital stats, you can access a really extensive blog post called The Vital Podcast Statistics All Brands Should Learn About. This is going to give you absolutely everything you know from a statistics and facts standpoint when it comes to the podcast audience, both from a United States perspective, but also Canada. We've talked a lot about the growth of the market. This is going to give you absolutely everything you need to understand, who these listeners are, how big the audience is, and where the where the industry is going. So if you want to stay up to date on the exploding world of podcasts, the absolute best thing you can do as a next step is to go to jaraudio.com/vital stats. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. Good luck and happy podcasting.